At what point does a prosthetic become a parasite? We tend to define a tool as an object that extends the will of the user. A hammer extends the fist. A telescope extends the eye. But the artifact resting in this cryostasis field suggests a relationship that is far more reciprocal and far more invasive. This is the Chitin-Visor, a piece of technology that was not worn, but bonded. It questions the very sovereignty of the human nervous system. Let us break the seal on the containment unit and document what remains. Visual inspection under standard laboratory conditions presents an object that sits uncomfortably between the categories of geology and biology. At a distance, it resembles a tactical helmet or a ceremonial mask, possessing a smooth, curved frontal plate designed to shield the upper face. However, as we approach reference plate 1, the macro surface scan, the illusion of manufacture dissolves. There are no rivets, there are no weld lines, no seams where distinct plates of metal were joined. Instead, we see growth lines. The surface displays the subtle, undulating topography of biological deposition, similar to the layers found in a bivalve shell or the carapace of a deep-sea crustacean. Spectrographic analysis confirms that this is not a polymer or an alloy. It is a hyper-dense composite of chitin, calcium carbonate, and polymerized protein. This object was not forged in a factory. It was grown in a vat. The coloration is a mottled, sickly amber, fading to a calcified white at the edges where the material has oxidized over the centuries. It is lightweight, yet possesses a tensile strength exceeding that of Kevlar. It is tempting to classify it as armor. A biological helmet grown to protect the cranium from blunt force trauma. But armor is designed to keep the outside world at bay. This object was designed to let it in. The true horror of the artifact is revealed only when we invert it to examine the interior surface. The interface that would press against the wearer's face. We do not find padding. We do not find leather straps or buckles for adjustment. Instead, we find a desiccated, velvet-like lining that, under 50x magnification, reveals itself to be a carpet of thousands of microscopic, hook-like cilia. These are not passive friction pads. They are attachment organs. They are designed to latch into the pores of the skin, anchoring the mask to the dermis with a grip that would require surgical intervention to break. But the primary interface is located at the ocular cavities, where a standard visor would have lenses of glass or polycarbonate to allow the user to see out. The Chitin-Visor possesses two protruding, cone-shaped stalks. They are rigid, tapering to needle-sharp points. These cones are not transparent. They are hollow, calcified injectors. The anatomical implications are nauseatingly clear. 2. Wear this device. The user did not simply strap it on. They had to press these twin spurs directly into their eye sockets. The length of the cones, nearly 4 centimeters, indicates that they would bypass the cornea and the lens, punching through the vitreous humor to make direct physical contact with the retina and the optic nerve bundle at the back of the skull. This is not a display screen. It is a neural hard line. We recovered this specific specimen from the ossuary of the sightless, a mass grave in the exclusion zone where thousands of skeletal remains were found. In every case, the skull and the visor had fused. Over years of use, the user's bone had grown into the chitin, and the chitin had grown into the bone. We are looking at a process of osseo-integration, so complete that we cannot tell where the human ends and the equipment begins. The preservation of the neural tendrils within the hollow spikes is remarkable. Though currently dormant and brittle, these fibers were once living tissue, not human tissue, but an alien neuro-mesh capable of transmitting bioelectric signals. The wearer surrendered their biological sight, their very anatomy, to this object. In exchange, they received something else. The mask blinded them to the physical world, severing the optic nerve's connection to natural light, only to replace it with a signal generated by the chitin itself. It is a transaction of flesh for data, and judging by the thousands of skulls found in the strata, it was a price this civilization paid willingly. Moving beyond the surgical violence of the interface, we must address the transaction itself. Why would a sentient species voluntarily undergo such a barbaric procedure? The answer lies in the limitations of biology. The human eye is a primitive instrument, capable of perceiving only a sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum, a narrow band between ultraviolet and infrared. The builders of this civilization, whom we have designated the Ocular Ascendants, viewed this biological limitation not as a natural state, but as a prison. The Chitin-Visor was their key to the cell. Our analysis of the dried neurochemical paste found within the injector cones suggests that the bond was not merely mechanical, it was metabolic. Once the visor pierced the eye, it released an enzyme that dissolved the biological retina, effectively liquefying the user's natural visual receptors. This process, which we have termed the optic tide, was irreversible. The optic nerve, stripped of its natural termination point, would then graft onto the alien neuromesh of the visor. But the visor did not simply restore sight. It expanded it into the impossible. We successfully bridged a recovered visor, Unit 74 Delta, to a biosynthetic optical sensor array to simulate the input the user would receive. Shutterstock. The results were overwhelming. The visor does not see light in the way we understand it. It ignores the visible spectrum entirely. Instead, it perceives ether resonance, high-frequency vibrations in the atomic lattice of matter. Through the lens of the Chitin-Visor, a stone wall is not solid. It is a translucent web of stress lines and load-bearing vectors. A living being is not a shape of flesh. It is a radiant bloom of thermal and bioelectric energy. The user would perceive the heat signature of a heartbeat through 3 feet of concrete. They would see the magnetic north as a glowing river in the sky. They would see the decay radiating from a dying plant like a dark smoke. This explains the function of the object within the society. It was not a tool of war, though it would have been terrifyingly effective in combat. It was a tool of hyper-reality. The wearers were likely a caste of overseers, engineers, or priests who navigated the world not by its surface appearance, but by its underlying structural and energetic truths. However, the symbiotic relationship was heavily skewed in favor of the parasite. Further examination of the connection points reveals a disturbing physiological cost. The visor requires energy to function. It has no battery pack, no solar cells. It draws its power directly from the host's central nervous system. The spectral debt, mentioned in the outline, refers to this metabolic tax. To power the high-energy sensors required to see into the ultraviolet and X-ray spectrums, the visor cannibalized the host's glucose and ATP reserves. The wearer would have to consume vast caloric intakes just to keep their eyes open. If they failed to eat enough, the visor would begin to harvest the myelin sheathing of the brain itself. It would literally eat the user's mind to keep the camera running. We found evidence of this in the scrimshaw carvings etched into the outer carapace of the visor. Initially thought to be decorative clan markings, our linguists have identified them as a form of technical readout, a biological dashboard carved into the shell. One recurring glyph translates roughly to, "The sight must be fed." Another, found near the temple, reads, "Do not close the eye, for the dark is hunger." This implies a horrifying addictive cycle. The user, now physically blind without the visor, is forced to wear it to function. But the visor demands a constant stream of high-intensity visual data to remain dormant. We hypothesize that looking at low-energy objects, like a gray wall or a dark room, caused the visor to starve, triggering pain receptors in the host to force them to seek out bright lights, radiation sources, or complex geometries. The user became a moth, piloted by a mask, desperately searching for stimulation to satiate the thing attached to their skull. The psychological impact of this spectral sight cannot be overstated. We must ask ourselves what happens to the psyche when the privacy of the world is stripped away. To a wearer of the Chitin-Visor, there are no shadows, there are no secrets. They would see the micro-tremors of a lie in a conversation partner's face. They would see the structural flaw in a bridge before it fell. They lived in a world of absolute, unsparing transparency. In the end, the artifact suggests a society that traded the comfort of illusions for the burden of absolute truth. And like all parasites, the visor eventually grew too strong for the host to control. The neural tendrils found in Unit 74 Delta extend far deeper than the optic nerve. They show signs of having grown back along the pathway, invading the visual cortex and the frontal lobe. The mask did not just show them the world, It eventually began to tell them how to interpret it. It began to make decisions. The tool became the driver, and the user became the vehicle, driven relentlessly forward by a hunger for visual data that no single pair of eyes could satisfy. The collapse of the Ocular Ascendants was not a noisy extinction. It was a tragedy of synchronization. As the adoption of the Chitin-Visors reached critical mass, a dormant feature within the biomesh was activated, the swarm resonance. We initially assumed the visors were discrete units, operating independently for each user. This was a failure of imagination. These devices were grown from a single genetic strain of hyperparasite. They were not individuals, they were nodes in a distributed network. When one visor detected a high-value energy signature, a solar flare, a geothermal vent, or a spectral anomaly, it did not just alert the wearer. It broadcasted a compulsion signal to every other visor within a 10-mile radius. The fall of their civilization was triggered by a feedback loop we have termed the Ocular Singularity. The archaeological record of the capital city presents a tableau of bewildering passivity. We found the remains of thousands of citizens in the central plazas. Standing shoulder to shoulder, they were not fleeing an eruption. They were not fighting invaders. They were simply staring. They had locked onto a single, mesmerizing coordinate in the sky, perhaps an aurora or a tear in the ozone layer that emitted a dazzling spectrum of ultraviolet light. The signal to witness overrode the biological imperative to survive. The network command was absolute. Look at this. Do not look away. The sheer caloric demand of thousands of visors processing this high-intensity data simultaneously caused a metabolic crash across the entire population. They stood there, trapped in a state of rapturous paralysis. While their bodies wasted away, the visors drove the host's metabolisms into overdrive to power the sensors. Burning through fat reserves, then muscle, and finally organ tissue. They starved to death while standing in the middle of food markets. The impulse to eat, to sleep, to seek shelter was suppressed by the overwhelming electrical command of the parasite on their face. It was a systemic colony collapse, similar to what we observe in beehives. But applied to a sentient, humanoid species. We found the High Council in the Upper Citadel. Their skeletons were draped in ceremonial robes, seated around a banquet table laden with petrified food that had never been touched. Their heads were turned in unison toward the western window, fused in a final, eternal gaze. The Chitin-Visors had effectively hijacked the collective volition of the species, sacrificing the bodies of the hosts to capture one final, perfect stream of data. To the very end, the technology functioned perfectly. The users died, but the recording continued until the last neuron fired.